This is incredible. I can't believe what I'm seeing. This changes everything.
The office on the 47th floor was a glass-walled sanctuary of silence. But for Lee Sang-hoon, the air felt thick with the scent of old paper and missed opportunities. He sat behind his obsidian desk, the black and white photograph resting on the polished surface like an open wound. He didn't call his usual team of enforcers for this. Instead, he summoned Park, a man whose specialty was not breaking bones, but unearthing ghosts from digital graves. "Find them," Sang-hoon commanded, his voice a low rasp that didn't match his perfectly pressed suit. The woman, the boy, every address, every hospital record, every breath they've taken since this photo was snapped. Park bowed and vanished, leaving Sang-hoon alone with the image of his father's hidden smile. For the next 48 hours, the Iron King was a ghost in his own empire. He canceled meetings with shipping magnates and ignored the frantic texts from his board of directors. He spent the nights tracing the contours of the woman's face in the photo, wondering if she was the reason his father had always seemed to be looking at a distant horizon even when standing right in front of him. When Park returned, he didn't bring a dossier. He brought a single, heavy envelope. He placed it on the desk with a look of practiced neutrality that couldn't quite hide a flicker of pity. Sang-hoon reached out, his leather-gloved fingers hesitant for the first time in his life. He pulled out a death certificate first. Elena Rossi passed away 3 years ago. Complications from a heart condition she couldn't afford to treat. The breath left Sang-hoon's lungs in a silent rush. The woman who had made his father smile was gone, buried in a communal plot in a town called Valdiorcia. He felt a strange, hollow grief for a stranger, a mourning for the answers he would never get. But as he turned the page, his heart hammered against his ribs. There was a recent photograph. It was a surveillance shot, grainy and taken from a distance. It showed a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, hauling a heavy sack of flour into a storefront with a faded awning. The sign above the door read Rossi and Sons Bakery. The young man was wiping sweat from his brow, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted in white. He had the same stubborn set of the jaw that Sang-hoon saw in the mirror every morning. This was Min-ho, the brother he was never supposed to know existed, living a life of sweat and struggle while Sang-hoon sat on a throne of cold steel. Sang-hoon stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He didn't look at the files again. He grabbed his coat, the weight of the photograph now heavy in his breast pocket. The empire could wait. The Iron King had a debt to settle with the past, and it started at a small bakery halfway across the world. The historic village of Valdiorcia was a masterpiece of golden stone and rolling cypress hills, a place where time seemed to move with the slow, deliberate pace of aging wine. It was a world of sunlight and open air, entirely at odds with the windowless boardrooms and rain-slicked alleys of Lee Sang-hoon's life and soul. He sat in the rear of the vintage black sedan, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum that felt like a sacrilege against the quiet morning. Through the tinted glass, Sang-hoon watched the village wake up. His leather-gloved fingers traced the edge of the photograph in his pocket, a silent anchor to his purpose. He didn't step out. In this town, he was a shadow, a foreign anomaly in a three-piece suit that cost more than most of these villagers earned in a year. Then, the door to the bakery creaked open. Min-ho emerged, carrying a wooden crate of steaming bread. Even from 30 yards away, the resemblance was a physical blow to Sang-hoon's chest. It wasn't just the face. It was the way the younger man moved, a certain briskness in his step, a tilt of the head that suggested a mind always 3 steps ahead. Min-ho set the crate down on a small outdoor table and wiped his brow with a forearm dusted in flour. He laughed at something a passing neighbor said, a bright, genuine sound that made Sang-hoon's grip tighten on the car's leather armrest. It was a life of labor, but it was a life of light. Sang-hoon lowered his sunglasses just an inch, his intense gaze dissecting every detail. He saw the frayed hem of Min-ho's apron and the way the young man's eyes lingered anxiously on a final notice taped to the window of the shop next door. The Iron King's analytical mind immediately calculated the math of the struggle. He recognized the signs of a business being suffocated, not by lack of talent, but by the weight of predatory interest rates. A group of local men in cheap, ill-fitting suits approached the storefront. Their body language was unmistakable, shoulders squared, voices raised, the casual thuggery of those who served a distant master. Sang-hoon felt a cold, familiar fire ignite in his veins. These were the bottom feeders of his own world, the microscopic gears in an international machine he sat atop. They were harassing his blood. He reached for the door handle, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. He wanted to step out, to show them what real terror looked like, to shield the brother who didn't even know he had a protector. But he stopped. If he stepped out now, the shadow of the Mafia would follow him into the bakery, staining the flour and the sunlight forever. He pulled the door shut, sinking back into the darkness of the car. He would help, but he would do it like a ghost. The bell above the door chimed with a modest, silver ring as Lee Sang-hoon stepped into the bakery. Immediately, the scent hit him, a thick, comforting haze of yeast, toasted grain, and sweetness that seemed to coat the back of his throat. It was an olfactory assault that felt more intimate than any touch, a ghost of a memory he hadn't known he possessed. The interior was small and bathed in the amber glow of the morning sun, a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile marble of his offices in Seoul. Min-ho was behind the counter, wiping his hands on a flour-stained apron. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met Sang-hoon's. The younger man froze, instinctively straightening his posture as if recognizing the predatory authority radiating from the stranger in the gray three-piece suit. "Can I help you, signore?" Min-ho asked, his voice steady but cautious. Sang-hoon didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his leather gloves, his gaze sweeping over the modest displays before settling on a tray of rustic, dark-crusted loaves. "I am looking for something specific," Sang-hoon said, his voice a low velvet rumble. "I represent a private investment group. We are scouting local heritage businesses." Min-ho's expression shifted from caution to a flicker of desperate hope, though he tried to mask it with professional pride. "We have been here for 30 years. My mother, she used my father's recipes. He was Korean, but he loved this land." Sang-hoon felt a sharp pang in his chest. "I will try the sourdough." Min-ho nodded and sliced a piece, handing it over with a slightly trembling hand. Sang-hoon took it. He lifted the bread, the crust crackling under the pressure of his fingers. As he took a bite, the world outside the bakery ceased to exist. The flavor was complex, tangy, earthy, and deeply honest. It was the taste of a man who had found peace, a man who had traded a throne of blood for a hearth of fire. For a moment, the Iron King was gone. Sang-hoon wasn't a boss or a killer. He was a son eating the bread his father had loved, a connection more profound than any ledger or lineage. He felt a sudden, irrational wave of envy for the brother standing before him, a man who lived in a world of flour and sunlight, oblivious to the darkness that funded his father's other life. Sang-hoon swallowed, the warmth of the bread settling in his stomach like a lead weight. He looked at Min-ho, seeing not an enemy or a rival, but a piece of himself he had never been allowed to be. "It is exceptional," Sang-hoon said softly, his intensity momentarily softening. "Tell me, Min-ho, how much do you owe the men who were outside earlier?" The younger man's face went pale, the light in the room suddenly feeling very fragile. Sang-hoon realized then that he wasn't just here to taste the past. He was here to ensure his brother had a future. The heavy silence that followed Sang-hoon's question was shattered by the violent kick of the bakery's front door. The bell, which had sounded so melodic moments ago, now gave a frantic, dying jingle as it hit the wall. Two men stormed in, their presence a sudden, oily stain on the sunlight. They were wearing cheap tracksuits and leather jackets, their faces twisted into expressions of practiced, low-level malice. Sang-hoon didn't move. He stood in the corner, a statue in gray wool, his sunglasses shielding the cold, lethal recognition in his eyes. He knew these men. They were street sweepers from the syndicate's European branch, men who technically reported to a lieutenant who reported to a captain who, ultimately, served at Sang-hoon's pleasure. "Time's up, Baker," the larger one snarled, his voice a gravelly intrusion. He didn't even notice Sang-hoon in the shadows. He reached over the counter and grabbed a fresh tray of cannoli, flipping it onto the floor with a casual, cruel flick of his wrist. The interest just doubled. "Our boss doesn't like to be kept waiting, and he has very little patience for bread makers who can't count." Minho's face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden counter until his knuckles turned as white as the flour on his apron. "I told you, the payment is coming. I have an investor now," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Sang-hoon. The thug laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "An investor? Look at this place. It's a tomb. Our orders come from the Iron King himself. He doesn't want your money anymore. He wants this land cleared for the new development. If you aren't out by the end of the week, we don't just break the ovens. We break the hands that use them." A cold, visceral horror washed over Sang-hoon. The Iron King. The name felt like a brand on his skin. He was looking at the machinery of his own making, a directive he had signed months ago as a mere line item on a spreadsheet for urban revitalization. He had authorized the destruction of this sanctuary without ever knowing it held the only piece of his father's heart that was still beating. The smaller thug reached for Minho's collar, but Sang-hoon stepped forward. The movement was silent, fluid, and carried the weight of a mountain. "Let him go," Sang-hoon said. The tone was not a request. It was an ultimatum that made the air in the room turn brittle. The thugs spun around, ready to mock the stranger, but the words died in their throats. They looked at the tailored suit, the black leather gloves, and the terrifying, motionless composure of the man before them. They didn't recognize his face. Few in the lower ranks ever did, but they recognized the aura of a high-level predator. "Who the hell are you?" the large one growled, though his hand drifted instinctively toward the waistband of his pants. Sang-hoon adjusted his cufflink, his gaze fixed on the man's eyes with a focus that promised a swift and quiet end. "I am the man who is going to give you exactly 10 seconds to leave this shop," he whispered. "And if you ever return, you won't just be out of a job. You will be out of a life." The scent of scorched sugar and yeast filled the air as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the fleeing debt collectors. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the ragged breathing of Minho. He stood paralyzed behind the counter, staring at the man in the gray suit who had just dismantled 2 predators with nothing but a whisper. "They won't be back today," Sang-hoon said, his voice returning to that calm, terrifyingly level tone. He didn't wait for a thank you. Instead, he pulled off his black leather gloves, tucking them into his pocket, and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt with methodical precision. "You have orders to fulfill. Show me how to work the dough." Minho blinked, confusion momentarily overriding his fear. You want to help? An investor? "I want to understand what my money is buying," Sang-hoon replied, though the lie felt heavy on his tongue. The hours that followed were a surreal dance of blood and flour. Sang-hoon's hands, which were more accustomed to signing death warrants and holding heavy calibers, were now buried in cold, elastic dough. Minho moved beside him, showing him the rhythmic fold and press of the rustic loaves. As they worked, the barrier of silence began to erode. Minho started to speak, not of debts or thugs, but of the man who had taught him this craft. "My father always said the bread knows when you're angry," Minho murmured, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "He was the gentlest soul I knew. He'd spend hours perfecting a single starter, talking about how a man's legacy isn't what he takes from the world, but what he feeds it." Sang-hoon's hands stilled in the flour. The gentle soul Minho described was a stranger to him. The father Sang-hoon remembered was a man of iron and ice, a king who had forged his son into a weapon through calculated cruelty and cold expectations. To Sang-hoon, his father was a shadow of fear. To Minho, he was a beacon of warmth. "He told me stories of a life he left behind," Minho continued, oblivious to the storm behind Sang-hoon's sunglasses. He said he'd lived in a world of gray stone and sharp edges, and that this bakery was his penance. He called it his resurrection. Sang-hoon looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw the reflection of the life he could have had if he hadn't been the firstborn, the heir, the sacrifice. He realized that while he had inherited his father's darkness, Min-ho had inherited his light. They were two halves of a fractured legacy, separated by a sea of secrets and a vintage black sedan. He was a complex man, Sang-hoon finally said, his voice barely a murmur. As the sun began to dip behind the Tuscan hills, painting the bakery in shades of deep amber, Sang-hoon felt a strange, terrifying warmth in his chest. He was no longer just an Iron King observing a target. He was a brother, dusted in flour, listening to the echoes of a father he was only just beginning to meet. The shadows in Val d'Orcia grew long and jagged as the sun dipped behind the stone clock tower, but for Lee Sang-hoon, the real darkness arrived in the form of a silver coupe parked at the edge of the piazza. He saw it from the bakery window, a car too modern, too aggressive for these ancient streets. He didn't need to see the driver to know who was inside. The world of steel had caught up to the world of flour. "Stay inside," Min-ho, Sang-hoon said, his voice dropping into that cold, rhythmic cadence that usually preceded a funeral. He didn't look back to see his brother's confused expression as he pulled his black leather gloves from his pocket, snapping them into place with a sound like a whip crack. Sang-hoon stepped out into the evening air, the scent of fresh rosemary and wood smoke suddenly feeling like a distant dream. Standing by the silver car was Ji-han, his second-in-command and most lethal enforcer. Ji-han didn't move. He simply leaned against the hood, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses that mirrored the golden sunset. He looked like a wolf in a sheep pen, his presence a violent disruption to the village's peace. "The board is asking questions, boss," Ji-han said, his tone devoid of emotion, yet vibrating with a dangerous curiosity. 4 days in a village that doesn't exist on any of our ledgers. No phone, no security detail, and you're covered in. Is that flour? Sang-hoon stopped 5 feet away, his posture a study in absolute, motionless authority. "You were not summoned, Ji-han." "I was worried," Ji-han replied, pushing off the car. He glanced past Sang-hoon toward the bakery, where Min-ho's silhouette was visible through the warm, yellow light of the window. "I find you protecting a debt-ridden baker who should have been evicted weeks ago. A man who looks remarkably like the photos of you when you were a cadet. The resemblance is problematic." The air between them turned brittle. Sang-hoon realized then that his secret wasn't just a personal revelation, it was a liability. To the syndicate, a half-brother was not family. He was a lever, a point of leverage that could be used to bend the Iron King to the board's will. "He is nobody," Sang-hoon lied, the words tasting like ash. Ji-han smiled, a slow, thin line that never reached his eyes. "If he is nobody, then you won't mind if I clean up the loose ends. The development project is behind schedule. The Iron King doesn't let sentiment stall progress." "I am the Iron King," Sang-hoon whispered, stepping into Ji-han's personal space until their chests nearly touched. The intensity radiating from him was enough to make the enforcer's smile falter. "And I have decided that this bakery is no longer part of the project. Go back to Seoul. Tell them I am finishing a personal acquisition. If you look at that window again, you won't live to see the sunrise." Ji-han stared back, the silence heavy with the threat of a coup. For a heartbeat, the world of blood and the world of peace balanced on a knife's edge. Finally, Ji-han bowed, too low, too mockingly, and got back into the car. As the silver coupe roared away, Sang-hoon remained in the square, the flour on his sleeves feeling like white blood. The hunt had begun, and he was no longer the hunter. He was the shield. The morning light felt thinner, colder, as if the village itself knew the wolves were circling. Inside the bakery, the air was still warm with the scent of rising dough, but for Lee Sang-hoon, the sanctuary had already been breached. His encrypted phone, a device that usually remained as silent as a grave, began to vibrate against the wooden prep table with a relentless, rhythmic buzz. He didn't want to answer it. He wanted to stay in this world of flower and quiet truths. But the Iron King knew that silence was often interpreted as a surrender. He stepped into the small back alley, leaning against the sun-warmed stone wall as he swiped the screen. "Speak," he commanded, his voice a sharp blade that cut through the chirping of the local birds. "The board has lost patience, boss." A senior director's voice crackled from Seoul, devoid of the usual subservience. "The Val d'Orcia acquisition has stalled. A local holdout is refusing to sign the final land release for the luxury resort project. The investors are threatening to pull out if the ground isn't broken by Friday. They're calling it a problem that requires your personal touch." Sang-hoon's grip tightened on the phone until the casing groaned. He looked through the back door, watching Min-ho carefully arrange a tray of golden croissants. The problem was his brother. The land release was the very floor Min-ho stood upon. The syndicate wasn't asking him to return to lead. They were asking him to return and execute the final blow against the only family he had left. "I am aware of the situation," Sang-hoon replied, his eyes narrowing as he watched a black SUV crawl slowly past the end of the alley. "I am handling it." "Handle it quickly," the director warned. "If you don't return with a signed deed by tomorrow, the board will authorize an aggressive liquidation of the asset, and they'll send someone who doesn't have your recent distractions." The line went dead. Sang-hoon stood in the shadows, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a mountain of lead. For years, he had been the architect of this very ruthlessness. He had built an empire on the idea that people were obstacles and land was currency. But as he walked back inside and saw Min-ho humming a tune their father used to whistle, the gray suit felt like a shroud. He realized then that there was no middle ground left. He could not be the Iron King and a brother. He could not protect the bakery while leading the men sworn to destroy it. The syndicate had presented him with a problem, but Sang-hoon was already formulating a different solution, one that would require him to burn his own throne to the ground to keep the ovens hot. "Everything okay?" Min-ho asked, noticing the tension in Sang-hoon's jaw. "The world is moving faster than I anticipated," Sang-hoon said, his voice soft but resolute. "We need to work quickly today. There is much to prepare for." The blue light of the laptop screen was the only illumination in the small apartment above the bakery, casting sharp, skeletal shadows across Lee Sang-hoon's face. He had traded his three-piece jacket for a simple black sweater, but his movements remained as cold and surgical as ever. His fingers, still faintly smelling of the sourdough he had kneaded with Min-ho, danced across the keys with a lethal rhythm. This was the beginning of the end for the Iron King. With a series of encrypted keystrokes, Sang-hoon began the invisible surgery on his own empire. He navigated through the labyrinthine offshore accounts that held his personal fortune, wealth built on decades of shadow and steel. One by one, he initiated blind transfers, rerouting millions into a series of trust funds and shell companies designed to benefit a single person, Min-ho Rossi. It was enough to ensure that the bakery would not only survive but thrive for generations, a silent gift of reparations for the years of silence. But money was not enough. To protect Min-ho, the syndicate itself had to be decapitated. Sang-hoon opened a hidden partition in his hard drive, revealing the Black Ledger, a digital record of every bribe, every shipment, and every high-level connection the syndicate maintained across Europe. It was the collective heart of the board of directors. With a steady hand, he began uploading the files to a secure, anonymous portal belonging to the International Criminal Police. Each file sent felt like a brick pulled from the foundation of his own throne. He watched the upload bars move with the detachment of a man watching his own house burn. He was leaking the locations of their primary distribution hubs and the identities of the corrupt officials who kept them in power. By tomorrow morning, the syndicate would be too busy fighting off a dozen coordinated raids to worry about a small bakery in Tuscany. A floorboard creaked behind him. Sang-hoon closed the laptop in one fluid motion, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where he kept his leather gloves. Min-ho stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're still up," the younger man said, his voice tired but warm. The investment must be more complicated than I thought. Sang-hoon looked at his brother, the man who represented everything he was about to lose and everything he hoped to gain. For the first time, the weight of the crown felt light, because he was finally taking it off. "It is nearly finished," Sang-hoon said, his voice softening. "The debts are being cleared. The path is being made straight." Min-ho smiled, unaware that the stranger in his kitchen was currently setting the world on fire to keep him warm. "I don't know why you're doing all this for us, Sang-hoon. But thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Sang-hoon replied, his eyes fixated on the window where the first hint of a stormy dawn was beginning to break. The transition is always the most dangerous part. The sky over Val d'Orcia finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the golden dust of the piazza into a slick, obsidian mirror. Inside the bakery, the air was warm and smelled of cooling loaves, a fragile pocket of peace that Lee Sang-hoon knew was about to be shattered. He stood by the window, his gray suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled tight against his forearms. He wasn't looking at the rain. He was watching the three black sedans that had just rounded the corner of the clock tower. "Min-ho, get in the cellar." "Now," Sang-hoon said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Min-ho looked up from the counter, a dusting of flowers still on his cheek. "What?" "Sang-hoon, it's just a storm." "It is not a storm," Sang-hoon interrupted, his gaze never wavering from the street. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his black leather gloves, pulling them on with a slow, ritualistic finality. "Do not come out until the engine noise stops. If you love this place, move." Something in Sang-hoon's eyes, a cold, ancient darkness Min-ho had never seen, extinguished any further argument. Min-ho scrambled toward the back, the heavy wooden door of the cellar thudding shut just as the first sedan screeched to a halt outside. The front door of the bakery exploded inward. Glass rained down like diamonds as three men in tactical gear stepped through the mist, suppressed submachine guns raised. They were professionals, the syndicate's elite erasers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were here to liquidate the asset. Sang-hoon moved before the lead man could find his rhythm. He was no longer the investor or the apprentice. He was the Iron King, a creature of calculated violence. He caught the first man's wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening pop, and used the weight of the falling body as a shield against the second man's fire. The muffled thwip-thwip of the bullets thudded into the Kevlar vest of his dying subordinate. In the dim light, Sang-hoon was a blur of motion. He disarmed the second man with a brutal strike to the throat and spun him around, using the man's own weapon to neutralize the third. The room, once a sanctuary of flour and yeast, was suddenly filled with the copper tang of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The heavy cellar door creaked open just an inch. Min-ho peered out, his eyes wide with a soul-crushing horror. He saw the bodies, the blood staining the white dusted floor, and his brother standing in the center of the carnage. Sang-hoon stood perfectly still, his chest barely heaving, his gloved hands steady. He looked at Min-ho, really looked at him, and the mask of the Mafia boss finally cracked. "I am sorry you had to see the man I was," Sang-hoon whispered through the rain drumming on the roof. "But it is the only way to ensure you can be the man you are." He turned back to the door, stepping out into the storm to meet the rest of the shadows, leaving his brother alone in the ruins of their father's dream. The vintage black sedan sat abandoned on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, its engine ticking in the cooling night air. Lee Sang-hoon stood 100 yards away, the remote detonator heavy in his hand. He had stripped off the three-piece suit, the silk tie, and the bespoke watch, the trappings of a king who no longer wished to rule. In their place, he wore a simple, worn jacket and the resolve of a man who had finally seen his own reflection and decided to break the glass. With a single, steady thumb press, the world turned white. The explosion was a thunderous roar that swallowed the silence of the coast, a blossoming flower of orange flame and black smoke that lit up the dark waves below. He watched as the metal carcass of his past life tumbled into the surf, disappearing into the churning water. To the authorities and the syndicate, The Iron King had perished in a tragic accident, a victim of the very chaos he had spent a lifetime trying to control. 3 months later, the sun rose over Val d'Orcia with a gentle, golden warmth that felt like a blessing. The piazza was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic sweeping of a broom against the cobblestones. Inside the bakery, the air was a thick, fragrant cloud of yeast and hope. Sang-hoon moved with a new kind of precision. He wasn't tracking shipments or calculating casualties. He was measuring grain and water. His hands, no longer hidden behind black leather gloves, were stained with the honest white of flour. The scars on his knuckles were still there, but they were fading beneath the daily labor of the hearth. "The oven is ready, apprentice," Minho called out from the back, his voice bright and full of the life that Sang-hoon had fought to save. Sang-hoon looked up and smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He picked up a heavy sack of flour, the weight familiar and grounding. He didn't have a throne or an empire, and his name was no longer whispered in the halls of power with fear. To this village, he was simply a quiet man with a mysterious past and a talent for the sourdough. As he began to knead the morning's dough, the rhythm of the work felt like a prayer. He had traded the cold steel of the Mafia for the warm crust of the bakery, and for the first time in his life, Lee Sang-hoon was not a boss, a weapon, or a legend. He was just a brother, finally home. The legacy of the Iron King was not buried in the wreckage of a seaside cliff, nor was it preserved in the offshore accounts that now quietly funded a bakery's future. Instead, the true legacy of Lee Sang-hoon began in the silence of those early Tuscan mornings, where the only judgment came from the rise of a loaf and the warmth of a brother's smile. His journey serves as a powerful testament to the idea that wealth is not worth if it functions as a gilded cage. For years, Sang-hoon had mistaken expensive wool and leather for skin, realizing only too late that his armor was actually a barrier, preventing him from feeling the very world he sought to control. He learned that a man's value is not measured by the fear he instills in his enemies, but by the peace he cultivates for those he loves. His transformation underscores the radical power of choice. In the shadow of his father's syndicate, Sang-hoon had been raised to believe that his path was an inescapable bloodline, a grim business passed down like a genetic curse. Yet, he proved that even at the height of absolute power, one possesses the agency to walk away and begin again. By dismantling his own throne, he demonstrated that real strength is never found in the intimidation of the weak, but in the quiet, steady resolve to provide a sanctuary for the innocent. He traded a crown of steel for a life of service, discovering that the ability to protect a single storefront was a more profound victory than ruling an international empire. Ultimately, the story reveals the true value of the simple life. As Sang-hoon stands at the wooden workbench, his fingers white with the dust of the earth, he finds a contentment that a lifetime of luxury could never provide. The flour on his hands represents a clean break from a stained past, a tactile reminder that redemption is found in the work we do for others. He finally understood his father's resurrection, that the most successful life is not the one that amasses the most power, but the one that finds its home in the warmth of the hearth and the bonds of brotherhood. Lee Sang-hoon had died as a king, but he finally began to live as a man.